It's my great pleasure to introduce the Reverend Dr. Karen Hamilton, who is the General Secretary for the Canadian Council of Churches, the broadest ecumenical council in the world. And I'm hopeful that when I'm done the introduction, Karen will recognize herself, because when you go through these things, you usually end up feeling either humbled or exhausted when you realize what you've been up to. So here we go. As the General Secretary for the Canadian Council of Churches, she facilitates witness and action among 22 denominations from the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox, Anglican, Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Evangelical traditions through a consensus model of governance. She's deeply committed to speaking about and working for ecumenism, interfaith dialogue, and the use of the Bible in the Church and for local and global justice. From 2006 to the present, she has served as president of the Canadian World Conference on Religions for Peace. From 1996 to 2002, she was the senior minister at, and I will just say this, St. James-Bond United Church, where she was involved in leadership in all levels of church courts, in administration, youth ministry, ecumenical and interfaith relations, pastoral care, word, and sacrament. On May 27, 1995, Karen was ordained for the Toronto Conference of the United Church of Canada. She was educated in 1979. She received her Master of Divinity degree from Emmanuel College at TST, the Toronto School of Theology, as well as a basic certificate in clinical pastoral education.
Wow.
From that same institution, she received her doctorate in theology in 1997, with areas of specialization in the Pentateuch, pre-exilic prophets, feminist hermeneutics, and wisdom literature. And in 2001, in her spare time, completed a doctorate of ministry degree. She's fluent in French, Hebrew, Italian, German, Greek, and Latin. Who's feeling inadequate? In 2009, Dr. Hamilton became a member of both the Tony Blair Faith Foundation and the Belinda Stronach Foundation. She continues to serve as governor of the Canadian Centre for Diversity and is the program presenter for the Canadian Council of Christians and Jews. She's a member of the Emmanuel College Council, chair of the World Federalists of Canada, as well as member of the Council for the International World Federalist Movement. In 2001, she was the proud recipient of the Heritage Day Award from the Association of Progressive Muslims of Ontario. She's also published, because in her spare time she writes. Dr. Hamilton has published in a variety of church and theological journals, including The Observer, Mandate, and the Toronto Journal of Theology, as well as editing work for Reverend Publishing and the Anglican Publishing House. Other interests also include, in the rest of her spare time, training as a classical singer, languages, reading, walking, swimming, piano, to name a few. She's married and is the mother of 3 children. Tonight's lecture, it's hard not to love you, but it's easy to despise you when you rattle this off. And I'm tired just reading it. Tonight's
You don't have to read it all.
For such a time as this, we'll examine the life of the biblical woman Esther, who found herself in a place of privilege and responsibility within the community. With courage and at great personal risk, Esther spoke and acted for the sake and the life of her people. How might we, so much more privileged in terms of personal safety, manifest such courage and creativity so that our world is transformed? Ladies and gentlemen, we don't really despise you, we're just jealous. Please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Karen Hamilton.
You are funny.
Please forgive me.
I will forgive him totally. You can really hear me. I know that. I can tell that from here. And I have to say, I'm not actually fluent in Greek and Latin. Does that make it any better?
Oh, I feel better.
Thank you so much for the privilege of being here. That was indeed a fulsome introduction. Thank you for that. I vaguely have some idea of what you were talking about, but not entirely. But it is such a privilege to be here. As I was driving here along the 401 and it was snowing, and it wasn't supposed to have been snowing, but after all, we're getting close to London. I was thinking of that phrase, and I don't know whether you probably do get the commercials here, but they'd be headed in the other direction. You know that leather store, the old Hyde House, and they say it's worth the drive to Acton? Yes. It's worth the drive to London. Thank you very much for having me. Already I have been met and received so graciously. It's such a privilege to be here. There are people here that I know. There are people here who've reviewed my book, actually, which I found out when I got here. And there are people I know from a variety of very different contexts. So if that's not mysterious enough, do come and speak to me at the reception afterwards, and I'll point some of these people out and introduce you to them. Thank you, Sister Susan, and all the rest of my gracious dinner companions. I indeed want to speak to you tonight, first and foremost, about the Bible. Now, I am United Church of Canada clergy, and so I can make this joke, okay? But often when I was at United Church meetings, I would have my Bible, of course it's red, because my life is pretty much red, with me, and people would say, "That's kind of rash, actually, a Bible at a United Church meeting. What are you thinking?" That's too much of a United Church joke, I guess. But I want to start tonight by having us think together about the biblical woman Esther. We all know her name, most of us know her name, some of us know her name, but not always all of the parts of her story. The biblical woman Esther found herself in a position of great privilege and responsibility. She's in the Old Testament, the part of Scripture that Christians refer to as the Old Testament, so a story that is very much shared with our Jewish sisters and brothers, although for those of you who like the nitty-gritty, textual kind of academic research, you find that our Jewish sisters and brothers have part of the book of Esther, and we have extra parts, and the Septuagint gets into all that, and it's all, fun and games for biblical scholars who like to spend their time and energy doing that sort of thing. I used to be one of those, but not so much anymore. Esther, the Jewish woman, was queen of Persia. Not exactly something that happens every day to a Jewish woman to be queen of Persia. She was not the first queen of Persia. She was not the first queen of that particular king of Persia. She was not queen of Persia by choice. It was a time and a place where women had fewer choices than they do today, and at least I must say, fewer choices than they do in the northern and western parts of the world. Many of our sisters across the world still have very limited choices in terms of their lives. But through a series of events over which Esther had no control, she finds herself in this position of privilege and responsibility. And then she finds out that there is a plot to destroy those of her people who are living in the land of Persia, those Jewish people living in the land of Persia. Her uncle Mordecai comes to her, explains the plot to her, and here's the biblical quote, because when you're dealing with an Old Testament scholar, you've always got to have a biblical quote. Mordecai charges her to go to the king to make supplication to him and entreat him for her people. Esther, chapter 4, verse 8. What Mordecai is asking of Esther may not sound to us in our time and place to be extraordinarily dangerous and risky, but it was in that time and place. It was risky to the point of death, because the way things worked in the court of Persia at that time, you could not simply, even if you were the queen, just go into the king's presence. To go to the king, as Mordecai was asking her to do, was for Esther to risk actual personal death. It's a challenge. It's a risk. It was difficult. It was a possible death sentence. Now, you and I, if I pause now, can remember so many people in our world who have taken that kind of risk. And perhaps it is indeed some of us who are here this night. But the names of Bishop Oscar Romero, Martin Luther King Jr. spring to mind, of course, immediately. And there are others who have taken the risk but not lost their lives. Aung San Suu Kyi, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu. The decision to put themselves forward into a situation of that kind of risk of death and possibly to lose their lives must have always been an agonizing one. Well, for Esther, it's an agonizing one, and she hesitates. She hesitates. She's human, after all, and Mordecai, as her uncle, has to use quite a number of strategies to persuade her to take that kind of risk of going into the king's presence without permission. The die is cast in his strategies, though, when he uses this line, chapter 4, verse 14. Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Perhaps she is called indeed to use her position of responsibility and privilege to save lives. What ensues after that, and when I was in the parish, I used to at weddings, particularly weddings, and some of you will be so familiar with this, when people wanted the book of Ruth read or a couple of verses read from the book of Ruth, during the wedding service I would say, well, the book of Ruth is only 4 chapters long, so I'm figuring that tomorrow, after the reception, tomorrow afternoon perhaps, a little sleeping in, none of you really have anything better to do than to read the rest of the book of Ruth. I gave homework at weddings. People seemed to think that was kind of odd. So perhaps you'd like to read the rest of the book of Esther after this lecture. Esther embarks on a number of very elaborate, clever schemes to make her point, to plead with the king, to let him know about the situation because he didn't even know about it. This is the book also, if I have to be even a little more titillating around this story, this is the book in the Bible that has the most to say about makeup. Who knew? Quite a lot, actually, if you read the beginning. The end of the story is very difficult, and there's a very difficult dynamic to the ending. But my purpose in bringing the character of Esther to you today is to bring forward the reality of privilege and the call to responsibility and action. What is it, we ask ourselves, that sometimes keeps us from taking action? What is it? I wonder if perhaps the fact that some of us have so much and live in one of the most peaceful countries on earth somehow, sometimes, incapacitates us. Is it the fact that some of the world's greatest and most painful difficulties seem so huge and insurmountable? Local issues and problems, perhaps sometimes, seem more real. More and more people in Canada are needing to turn to food banks. And the fact that so many are forced to live below the poverty line in our country is a scandal. But sometimes we seem particularly incapacitated by the problems that are global, that are larger, that are farther away. When I was serving in the parish, in my congregation, I had no trouble raising money to buy hymn books or put in an elevator. But when we were talking about the larger global issues affecting so many of our sisters and brothers around the world, it seemed always a more difficult conversation. You must have all heard it, the "what can I do" kind of phrase. Well, there's an author by the name of Peter Singer, and he writes a book entitled To Save a Life. And in the book, he uses a very powerful and a very painful example. He sets up a scenario in which you, the reader of the book, is on your way to work or on your way to a very important meeting, completely dressed in the wool suit, in the leather shoes, with the very expensive briefcase by your side. We're on our way to work, dressed to the nines, as the expression goes. Where does that expression come from? Please, somebody tell me that at the reception afterwards. I know all kinds of ones, like don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I know where that comes from, but dressed to the nines, I don't know. Anyway, you, the reader of that book, is on your way, dressed to the nines, to that very important meeting, and you pass a pond, and in that pond, a small child is drowning. Peter Singer points out that there is not one of us, not a single reader of his book, who would not leap into that pond to save the life of that child. None of us would hesitate to save that child's life. But then he goes on painfully to say, but why is it we don't care for the lives of children that are being lost in places farther from us? Why is it the immediacy that so grips us? And there are lots of reasons around human psychology which he points to. But he also points out how many children's lives are being lost while the reader is reading his book. He says, why does that matter less to us? I recently heard from a student actually going through for the Anglican priesthood a similar kind of story told in the prophetic form of science fiction. Science fiction is often extremely prophetic. And in this story, an alien race invades our planet and demands the lives of 1/10 of our children. And we are to choose which 1/10 it will be. There's a deadline. And of course, we, as the people of the planet, our hearts completely broken, cannot choose. We cannot choose which 10th of our children will be given up to death. The aliens give us more time and a new deadline. The hearts are broken, and people cannot choose. A third deadline is issued, but the agony of choosing is too great, and we cannot choose. The aliens then say, well, what is your problem? Why are you finding this so difficult? Because after all, 1/10 of your world's children are already dying because of extreme poverty, because of lack of clean water, because of lack of health care, and you don't seem to care about that. Why is this so different to you? What is the difference, they ask. The rock star, Bono, has a very similar and very graphic way of pointing to this very painful issue. And he snaps his fingers every 3 seconds. And he says, each snap represents the death of a child due to completely preventable poverty-related causes. Every 3 seconds, a child in our world dies for reasons that are completely, totally preventable. Every 30 seconds in our world, a child dies of malaria-related causes. We've known how to eradicate malaria for 100 years. We just haven't done it. We did it in Ottawa. We've done it in Canada. We haven't done it in the rest of the world. So the question is, why don't we do more about these things? I know. The issues are really complicated. They are really complicated. In many parts of the world, there is the legacy and reality of neocolonialism. Corruption is very real. Political structures are fragile. There are failed states. There are vast and important differences of opinion in terms of what's effective for long-term change. I know. But there is much that the privilege of living in Canada, there is much that our responsibility for mending the world, to use a Jewish phrase, tikkun olam, can accomplish. So I want to speak to you today very specifically about one of those mechanisms for accomplishing some healing in the world. And those are what's called the Millennium Development Goals. I know they are not exactly a household word. I know that. Or a household phrase, sorry, they're 3 words. But they should be. And I have brought them to you. There are cards like this somewhere at the back of the room. At the back of the room, right there. There are cards with the 8 Millennium Goals on them. They are 8 specific, concrete goals that were set in place by the 192 nations of the United Nations in the year 2000, and they are very specific. Here's the short version on the card. For those of you who want to look them up on the United Nations website, you get the longer version with some very clear and very accountable goals and targets. The short version goes like this. Eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Achieve universal primary education. Promote gender equality and empower women. reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, create a global partnership for development. They sound like motherhood and apple pie kinds of statements. Who could be against those kinds of statements for the future of the children of the world? And yet, they were set in place in the year 2000. All the countries, including Canada, of the United Nations agreed to them. They will make a tremendous difference in the lives of thousands and millions of our sisters and brothers on this planet. Thousands of millions of people who in our faith traditions we would call children of God. They will make a huge difference. And you can read all of the details on the UN website. And yet, our track record in terms of completing them is, not to put too fine a point on it, lousy. Lousy. They are supposed to be completed in 2015. You remember June. Remember June? The G8 and G20 countries met in Canada. It was kind of colorful. At least in Toronto, the newspapers are still reporting on an almost daily basis how all of that infringing of civil rights, of course I have no opinion on this kind of thing, but how all that infringing of civil rights is going. And there are cases around it. You remember those meetings, the G8 and the G20 are the self-selected, and that's important, self-selected most powerful economic countries in the world, or economically most powerful countries in the world, depending on how you want to say it. Canada is one of the G8. We have been for quite some time. The G20 is a newer creation. But the point is for those economically powerful countries to choose to come together. And when they do, they make decisions, because they are the most economically powerful countries in the world, they make decisions which affect the world in substantive ways. And it's unclear what's going to happen now. There's a G20 as well as a G8, but to date, they rotated around meeting in each of the G8 countries. And so, in 2010, it was Canada's turn. They promised to make substantial progress on the Millennium Development Goals. Now, let's get that clear. We who are sisters and brothers of a democracy, who promised exactly? Who's the they? The they is us. We have democratically elected our government, and our government speaks for us. And so when the government promises, they promise on our behalf. So they promised to make substantive progress. The progress isn't happening, and it hasn't been happening since the year 2000, and yet the promises keep being made, and we haven't been holding them accountable. We are people of a democracy. We haven't been holding them accountable. Here's where some of the figures come in, not too many, I promise. But before the economic crisis, and that's a very important phrase, before the economic crisis, the G8 was only complying with 51% of its own promises. And many of us in faith communities and those who work in areas of social justice would think that the G8 promises haven't gone nearly far enough in terms of alleviating poverty. But whatever you think of that, in terms of the promises they've actually made, they're only complying with 51%. Now, how can this be? Some of you are in school, some of you have children or grandchildren or nephews or nieces or good friends who are in school. If they tried to come home from school with a report card that had a 51% average and tried to convince you that that was acceptable, I venture to say that that wouldn't go all that well around your dinner table conversations. Well, that's just about marks. The Millennium Development Goals are about people's lives. People's lives are being held in the balance and lost. To go back to Bono and his snapping of the fingers, and some of you may be ahead of me on this, but to use his math that a child dies every 3 seconds of completely eradicatable poverty-related causes, that means that in the course of this time that I spent talking with you tonight, 1,200 children have died. How can we, as members of a rich and democratic country, remain silent? We have our issues, we have our problems, to be sure, to be sure, to be sure. And there are many in this country living below the poverty line, and there are many children who go to bed hungry. And that is a reality. As an economic power, though, we are part of the G8. We are considered to be, we're at the bottom, we are considered to be the 8th most economically powerful country in the world. Well, now it's complicated because of China and India. But at least a few years ago, we were considered to be the 8th most powerful economic country in the world. 51% compliance rate. How is it we've remained silent? Well, because I think we didn't know. I think we didn't know. And issues like global poverty and care for creation and peace and security seem so large. They're so overwhelming. So the not knowing and the being so overwhelmed when we do know, those are hard dynamics. Those are very hard dynamics. But now we do know. And one of the reasons we know so well about the 51% is because, and I found out, I have to tell you how I found this out, because it was a humbling moment. It was humbling for me, just so you know that, Bill. My oldest daughter is a lawyer in Ottawa, but she is also a G20 researcher. And there was this incredible moment, and I'm kind of telling a bit of the end of where I'm going with this speech before I get to the end of where I'm going with this speech. So don't get all excited that you know there's food quite yet. But she was a G20 researcher, and there was this night at our family dining table where I said, because of some contacts that had been made for me through the German church, the Evangelical Church of Germany, I came home one night and I said, you know, this was in 2007, I seem to be going to the G8 meeting in Germany. And she doesn't even look up from her plate, and she goes, oh, yeah, I'm going to that too. And I went, excuse me, a little more information here, please. I said, I'm going as part of a church leaders delegation, and the G8 will be meeting in Heiligendamm, and the church leaders will be meeting in Cologne. I said, where are you going to be? She said, well, I'll be in Heiligendamm, of course. And I said, okay, the church leaders, the faith leaders of the world, can't get any closer to the G8 than Cologne. How do you get to Heiligendamm? And she said, well, Mother, and then she wears glasses now, but she didn't at the time, it was just like this, so it was like, Mother, you know, you're so, you know, not with it. Mother, the professor I am working with, the professor I am doing the G20 research for, is the leading G8, G20 researcher in the world. And he can get us, his students, in anywhere. Do you see what's implicit in that story, though? Here in Canada, we have the leading G8, G20 research institution in the world. It's in Canada. Now, it's not at Western, I have to tell you. I'm very sorry. It is, however, at the University of Toronto. What was really embarrassing in the conversation with my daughter was that the office was across the street from my office, and I could see it from my window, and yet I had not known. I hadn't known. And you can just Google it, all of you who are fans of Google. My youngest, I have 3 kids, my youngest, my son says, how did you people even manage before Google? How did you even live? That's a question, I don't know. But you just Google G8 Research Group, and there it is. And what they do as an academic, independent body is track all the promises. They track all the promises that every G8 and every G20 country has ever made and how they're doing. And I have gone on speaking tours with the professor, and he just, I didn't bring PowerPoint, Sister Susan, I'm so sorry, but he has PowerPoint, and he just slaps up thermometers on the screen and says, okay, you want to know how Canada's doing on AIDS, HIV, what they promised and how they're doing? Here it is, right there. All this information is all available to us if we choose to make use of it. The reason I bring that to is for all kinds of reasons. One is to kind of lower some of the anxiety that we have that these issues are so big and so formless and there's nothing we can do about them. But there is, but there is, but there is. But it's also to tell you something else about the G8, G20 meeting in Canada in June that you might not know about. Some of you I know do. Dinner conversation, we talked a bit about it. Hanny, I know, knows about it as well, our newest Order of Canada member. The G8, G20 research group, as an academic organization, not a religious faith-based body, was a partner in this, I want to say this most amazing event, but I organized it. I don't think you can do that when you've organized something. This event that was a lot of work to organize that happened in Canada, in Winnipeg in June. Canada also hosted not only the G8, G20, but the 6th annual Interfaith Religious Leaders Summit to challenge the G8 and the G20. In 2005, when the G8 was meeting in the UK, the faith leaders of the world, suddenly the light bulbs went on. And the faith leaders of the world, knowing some of these figures that I've brought to you, said, we can't be silent in the face of this. We are the faith leaders of the world who represent the vast majority of the world's people, all of our faith traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, Baha'i tradition, First Nations. We are all grounded in care for and love of the neighbor. We can't be silent in the face of this. So, in 2005 began the first meeting of the faith leaders of the world, parallel to the G8, G20 meeting, to challenge the G8 and G20 to say, do better. A figure like 51% simply is not acceptable. Lives are being lost. Do better. We are your people. We will work with you. We will work together. It's not about taking pot shots at the government, but it's about making our voices heard. Since 2005, there has been a meeting every single year of the faith communities, the senior leadership of the faith communities. That first one was started, by the way, by Archbishop Rowan Williams and by the Reverend Jim Wallace, who is, some of you will know, probably the leading evangelical in the United States. And those were the two that brought it together the first year. Every year, every time the G8 meets, there's a parallel meeting. So June in Canada, when the G8, G20 met, is not to be remembered just entirely for the fake lake. Although we had that too. And as I mentioned earlier, these shocking infringements of civil liberties. But right before the G8, G20 meeting, for 3 days, the senior faith leaders of the world met. And they met in Winnipeg. And people would say to me, why on earth did you meet in Winnipeg? Well, it is the center of the continent. It's also where Lloyd Axworthy gave me a free university. So I said, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I had to give it back. But he donated the space for this, and one of the things I've discovered is that some of us of a certain age know who Lloyd Axworthy is, others don't. Lloyd Axworthy was one of Canada's foreign ministers and is a very practicing member of the United Church of Canada. So for 3 days, those leaders gathered. And in terms of the Canadian representatives, you know most of them, because Primate of the Anglican Church was the head of the Canadian delegation. The president of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, Bishop Morissette, was there. The past president of the Canadian Conference of Bishops, Archbishop Weisgerber, was there. The territorial commander of the Salvation Army was there. The moderator of the United Church of Canada was there. The representative of the Canadian Council of Imams was there. A senior representative of Canadian Jewish Congress was there. The Hindu Federation was there. The First Nations Anishinaabe people on whose land the University of Winnipeg stands not only were full delegates, but gave us formal permission to meet and to host the faith leaders on their land. The Buddhist community was there. Shinto priests from Japan were there. Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia was there, a representative of the Vatican, the General Secretary of the All Africa Conference of Churches, and I can go on and on and on and on. The theme speakers included Romeo Dallaire, who, not surprisingly, got a standing ovation. Jim Wallace also was a theme speaker, and of course the General Secretary of the All Africa Conference of Churches was one of our theme speakers. Of course, when you're talking about the Millennium Development Goals, you're often talking about Africa. And he was eloquent and absolutely amazing. And had to follow, actually, Romeo Dallaire, who of course talked about his experiences in Rwanda. And the current General Secretary of the All Africa Conference of Churches is from Rwanda. And so it was a hard and painful moment when he then had to be the next speaker, and he got up to the podium and said, "This is really hard. But for the sake of my sisters and brothers who are dying, still, because of the lack of compliance with the Millennium Development Goals, I can continue," and he did. A statement was agreed upon by all of those faith traditions representing all of the G8 countries of the world and all of the regions of the world, and it went forward to the G8, G20. It was received by one of Stephen Harper's cabinet ministers, Stephen Fletcher, and it went forward. Now, one never knows. You can't say for sure that what the effect will be, but one of the things that I do know is that the effect will not be if we do not raise our voices, and if we do not continue in consistency of message, continuing to speak about such things as the Millennium Development Goals, and with persistency, year after year after year, saying to our elected leaders, we care, and the promises matter to us. There was substantive press coverage, although I'll bet you not too many of you read about it in the press, because the press are very selective. And one of the things that doesn't always grab their attention is when the faith leaders actually talk to each other. I have heard press say to me, "You people are only interesting when you're throwing chairs at each other." So we have to push at that dynamic as well. In 2011, the G8 will be meeting in France. Watch for the I know what the dates are unofficially. The official dates apparently are going to be spoken out loud by Sarkozy on the 24th of June. So, 24th of June. I just drove to London in the snow. No, on the 24th of January, Sarkozy is going to announce the dates of the G8 meeting in June. And I have been working with the French to help them, because of course each country does their own thing around this. There is some continuity, but it is up to each country to self-define and self-select. So I have been working with the French to help them as best I can in planning their event. I have no idea what it will look like or when it will be, but we try. The biblical book of Esther. That quote I read, "For just such a time as this." I was asked at dinner what it is that I spend most of my time doing, and I said most of it is administration, to be truthful. And for those of us who worked for 3 years to have the faith leaders meet in Canada, it just felt like administration for 3 solid years, and we literally wrote thousands of emails to enable this to happen, but that is how these things happen. What I believe, though, is it continues for each one of us to be just such a time as this, for us as communities, for us as individuals. Now, Christians, speaking only about Christians, Christians like to do things in threes. We like to do that in reference to Trinitarian theology, or at least to say we do it in reference to Trinitarian theology. The Trinitarian theology, which is at the heart of our faith as Christians. And so I bring to you tonight 3 particular ways in which you as individuals, you as communities, can make a difference. The child is in the pond. It's just that the pond, in some cases, is farther away than on our way to work, but the child is still at risk. So 3 things. One that you can do is to take copies of this Millennium Development Goal card, which is still at the back, because I haven't seen it move anywhere in the course of my time up here. Take as many as there are. Call me, I'll send you more. We have thousands back at the Canadian Council of Churches office. Give them to your family and friends. Make sure everybody you know has heard of the Millennium Development Goals. Education is a big part of it. Send the Keeners to the United Nations website. On the other side is a website called faithchallengeg8.com, which gives you some of the history of the summit and tells you some ways to go forward, which is going to be point number 3, actually. But we'll go to point number 2 first. You've seen this one coming. Those of you who've been kind of, tracking what I'm saying, you've seen this one coming. So the second thing, so the first thing is the education. Take the Millennium Development Goals cards everywhere you go. The second thing speaks to our responsibilities and privileges as members of a democratic society. Make an appointment with your member of parliament. Now, I have to say, this is going to sound kind of harsh, but I say this a lot, and everybody nods, and nobody ever does it. Please, make an appointment with your member of parliament. They have to see you. They can put you off. They can tell you their calendar is full for the next, 6 or 7 or 8 months, but they have to see you. Be persistent. Make an appointment. Take them one of the cards. You don't have to be an expert on the Millennium Development Goals. That's part of also, I think, what puts us into a state of kind of incapacity in terms of some of these larger issues. We listen to some of the people who are the real experts talk, and we think, well, we don't know that. We can't articulate that. We don't know quite what to do in terms of issues of corruption in Africa, or we don't know quite what to do in terms of, the most effective cure for malaria. Is it the nets? Is it, the medication that the nets have on them? There are complexities. Take them the card. And then, up the ante still further. Ask them to put it on their website. Put the Millennium Development Goals. On the website, Canada's signed on to them. Why would they not have it on their website? They've already agreed to it. One of the things we did in our office was we sent a letter around to all of the members of Parliament, and we talked about the Millennium Development Goals, and mostly you get this, nice form letter back, so-and-so has heard your concerns and, passed it on to so-and-so, but we've had several startling letters from federal members of Parliament writing back to say we have no idea what the Millennium Development Goals are. Quite startling, actually, that they're admitting it too. I think that's actually quite impressive. So, let's fix that. But you don't have to be an expert. Let your member of parliament know that you care. Now, even better would be to go as a delegation. Even better would be to go as an interfaith delegation. So, your Jewish friend down the street and your Muslim colleague and your Hindu sister-in-law and you as a Christian, you all go together. This, the government actually finds a little disconcerting. They like it when the faith communities talk together. But when you go forward and say, look at who we represent, so go see your MP. Let them know. Don't take complexity or we really are doing great as an answer. Because we do hear that when we speak to politicians. Say, okay, prove it. List the Millennium Development Goals on your website. Also don't take, this is a really interesting one, and some of you whose denominations are represented in the room here actually have said this to me. You're not you personally, but your denominations have said it. I've said to all of the faith traditions, put the Millennium Development Goals on your websites. And some of them have come back to me and said, oh no, our tech person won't allow it. I mean, your tech person won't allow it. Apparently it clutters up the home page or something. You can't put extra stuff on. I'm like, oh, come on. You can tell I'm not that much of a tech person. I didn't bring a PowerPoint with me, but okay. I often hear from politicians, often, that they don't hear from their constituencies. They don't know what we think and what we want. We don't tell them. We don't tell them. By all means, too, compliment them if they're doing something that you have asked for and that you think is really helpful and appropriate. By all means, tell them so. Tell them so. But I actually had Bill Blakey, some of you will know Bill Blakey, who is an NDP member of Parliament, and he said, and he's about twice as tall as I am, he's about 4 times as tall as Sister Susan. And his hands are the size of the Bible, and no one can figure out how he uses a BlackBerry because, his thumb covers like the entire screen, but he does. But he said, I have actually begged some of the Christian denominations to send me letters on issues. I've actually, as a member of Parliament, had to phone them up and ask for letters because I knew what they were thinking about something, but I had no paperwork. So when I went to try to argue the case, I had nothing in my hand to base it on. He said, I've actually had to resort to phoning some of your denominations. He said, tell us what you think. Tell us what you believe. Imagine, one of my fantasies, and I do like living in Technicolor. You've noticed that from the shoes already, but one of my fantasies is that every member of Parliament over the course of the next year would get 5 visits. It's not a lot to ask, but can you imagine if every member of Parliament got 5 visits, 5, from different members of their constituencies of different faith traditions, every one of them coming in with a Millennium Development Goal card and saying, hi there, put this on your website. We care. Canada is not doing well. People are dying. Can you imagine? What if also we then said, thank you very much for your time, Member of Parliament. Of course, we would like to see in 4 months from now in your constituents newsletter a detailed report of the progress Canada has made on the Millennium Development Goals in the last 4 months. We know that the figures are available. For heaven's sakes, the G8, G20 research group has them. We would like to see that from your point of view. Imagine. So those are 2 things. The one was quite short, where I said, take the card to all your family and friends. The second one was a long, diatribe about how to deal with MPs. And the third one is do something. What you will also find on this website, this is a shameless commercial, but that's my job, to do shameless commercials. It's in my job description. It really is, line 57. Organize an event. Go to the website, the Faith Challenge G8 website. There's a whole resource kit there about how to organize an event, an interfaith event that brings together Jews and Christians and Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs, First Nations people, Baha'i, Buddhist, brings them together. Have an event focused on the Millennium Development Goals. Invite the MP. And especially, oh, by the way, if there are youth involved, apparently, and I learned this fairly recently, it seems obvious, and apparently it's more obvious than we even thought. If there are youth involved, apparently the MPs come, because that's the future voting public of Canada, and so it's much more attractive to an MP if there are youth involved. If they don't come, take a picture of their place with their name tag and send it to me. Yeah, let's wait while you think about that one. We have the website. But all the information you need to do an event like that is on the website. There is a national campaign going on right now, between now and March 31st, to have these national events all the way across the country. And to encourage our MPs to listen, not talk. It's something occasionally a challenge for them. My sisters and brothers, the biblical woman Esther was very human, very, very human. And she was afraid, and she had her life to risk. Her life was at risk. And when you read the book, later tonight, tomorrow, on the weekend, Good Friday night activity, you will discover how cleverly she thought about her strategy and how she was going to, with fear, but also with courage, walk into this situation of tremendous risk. It's very clever. It does involve makeup. But it involves understanding her context, and it involves simply moving forward for the sake of people's lives. Be persistent. Be consistent. And know that for each one of us, it is indeed such a time as this. I'm not going away. I finished early on purpose because always the best things are said in the questions. Because I'm so wired apparently.
Hi.
Yes.
I'm Alice.
A little bit louder?
And my question is regarding the costs and spending
faith leaders?
Faith groups have an influence to limit the spending?
Nope. Thank you for the question. It's a great question. Well, I shouldn't just say no, but I imagine that it wouldn't be well received if we wrote and asked that. It's a very good question, and so many were asking that question around the time and saying, what if that money had been spent on anything else, like food banks or eradicating hunger for children who go to bed hungry? Not that I know of, and it's not an issue that we have addressed specifically because, and I said that a couple of times, but because of the trying to be persistent and consistent, one of the things we've heard from politicians too is stay very focused. And again, at Bill Blakey's story, others have said the same thing. They say, when you come to see us, only make 2 points, because that's all we can understand. That's their words. They said, do not make more than 2 points, and stop changing your points. Those of you who come, year to year to year, don't stop changing your points every year, because you throw us off track, and we don't know where to go. So stick to your same 2 points. So for now, although I would totally agree with you that was a scandal, we're staying very focused on the Millennium Development Goals, the environment, peace, and security.
St. Paul once said that the desire for money was the root of all evil. I used to think that was one of those platitudes. And I'm beginning to realize as I get older, he nailed it. And I don't have much faith in the government, actually. Because when you see what the U.S. does, what they've set the CIA to do in the past on the horrendous stories, what Monsanto gets away with, they even get themselves exempted from just laws, they have the power. And they don't care. Bush killed almost all the gains for workers that Nader managed to get. And it's so hope-killing when people make gains and then you see somebody with more power and different priorities just smash them down. Yeah. How do you fight money?
Yeah, I wish I had an answer to that. I phrase it sort of differently. And maybe it's to phrase it in the negative, but it goes back to what I said earlier about not staying silent. Yes, one can say yes to everything you said, but to stay silent in the face of it is not an answer. And it's the persistency and the consistency and the continuing to go forward when we can't see necessarily or even promise concrete results. One of the bizarre questions that I got, not bizarre, obvious, I guess, questions that I got right before the Interfaith Leaders Summit and right after was, well, what exactly is the government's or the G8 government's stance going to look like because of what the faith leaders have done? That term everybody's using now, measurables. I hate that term. They said, tell us exactly what the difference is going to be. How this Millennium Development Goal particularly is going to be made better. How this one might stay the same. It's like, we can't do that. We will never know. And one of the pieces of this too that is very significant is that the director of the G8, G20 research group, Professor John Curtin, is of course at all of the meetings. And he says that although the G8, and he's absolutely convinced of this, although the G8, because it was only the G8 then, in 2000, I think it was. When was the Jubilee campaign? It was 2000, right? Many of us remember. He said it was, and it wasn't this interfaith group of leaders meeting in such an intentional way, but he said it was the movement of the faith communities, in that case particularly the churches, pushing forward around the eradication of developing countries' debt that actually made a difference, and that Tony Blair said so. And that he said it wasn't in the G8 statement as a pronouncement that because the faith communities were so mobilized about that, it actually made a difference. But he, as someone who has studied this intensively, around the clock, and he does seem to work around the clock, I can send emails at night and I get answers. John Curtin says that absolutely that made a tremendous difference. And so it's partly about, it's about going forward in faith, which is what we all are also about. It's about not being silent. It's about being in it for the long term. One of the other things I say about this is it's about the long term. And that's a huge advantage that we, those of us who are members of faith traditions, bring. Because some of our traditions have been in existence for literally thousands of years. We understand long-term. We live in a culture that's, quick fix everything. And, how many buildings have we seen go up and then go down again in 20 years because they weren't properly constructed? Meanwhile, the abbeys of Europe stand for thousands of years. But we live in a quick fix society, and we're very impatient. We're very, very impatient. And so if we can't see it within a few weeks or months, we lose interest. And I do it. We all do it. It's part of our culture, and that's one of the things that we have to be resistant about. One of the things that Romeo Dallaire also says is that his heart so much is in Rwanda and the eastern Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes region. It's called. It's not just Canada that has the Great Lakes region. And Romeo Dallaire is asked often, what will it take to bring true peace to the Great Lakes region of Africa? And he says, it figures about 60 years. And he says, so it'll take 60 years. So we start today then. We'll start today. And it'll take 60 years. So it's not a satisfying answer, and I know that. None of this is particularly satisfying, and that's one of the places where I think we have to be resistant, is in terms of our own human desire to have things be satisfying and see something completed and say, yes, look at that. Millennium Development Goals number 4 and 5, they're done. Look at that. We matched the UN website. That's kind of what Harper was trying to do in the GH20. He worked on Millennium Development Goals 4 and 5. Yes, we would all love to see that. But I think we're called to the long term, and I think we're called to the long-term persistence and consistence. Push on towards it, people. Oh, lined up. They want coffee. It's not a light topic. I didn't promise you a light topic. Susan didn't promise you a light topic. It's a hard topic, but it's one of the ones that needs to be addressed.
Yes, I know we have to be persistent, but one of the things we also, and I use it in the right sense, I hope, fight the mainline media, because they spread so much they do brainwash, and they change the attitude of people, and that's what they work on every day of the year, every minute, every second. That's what they do in order to help the so-called economy, which is only an economy for the rich. It doesn't help the poor a bit. So in order to do that, we got to be persistent, and in the first place, I believe we should fight them, put them on the spot, and tell them these are lies, and it's not true, and you shouldn't, the government, people shouldn't use the media as to spread all those lies and brainwashing. You know, we accuse the Russians or the communists of brainwashing, but believe me, the capitalists brainwash just as much and more. And I'd like your answer to that.
I thank you for giving me a suggestion that I had not thought of before. So, when you're making your appointment with your MP, before you get away from your portable phone, make one with your local media and take them the Millennium Development Goal card and say, this is what I want to talk about. What if 5, 6, 4, 3 members of faith communities went in to talk to the media, took the Millennium Development Goal card and said, why isn't this splattered all over the front pages of the paper? And the fact that there's only a 51% compliance rate with the promises of this country? Let's see the Millennium. How about a series? How about there are 8 Millennium Development Goals. How about an 8-week series on each of the Millennium Development Goals? Some of the papers do that kind of thing, but to keep hearing it and hearing it and hearing it and hearing it, I've worked a lot with media, and one of the things that I have heard media say, this is going to be a bit challenging, I warn you, is when you challenge and say, well, how come you didn't report this or this or this or this? And they say, you know what? We report the things that You tell us you want to hear. Now, whether you believe that or not is sort of not the point. The point is, we're not, many of us, giving them constant feedback. So when I was at a series that did that with the media, I was the moderator actually, and I said, okay, take the challenge seriously. How many of you are going to phone the editor of your paper, or the editor of the Globe and Mail, or the editor of the National Post? I was going to say the Toronto Star, and I thought, maybe they don't say that in London. The London Free Press. Thank you very much. How many of you are going to phone them tomorrow morning and say, Millennium Development Goals? Let's hear more about that. It's now 6 months, 7 months past the G8G20 meeting. There was also a big deal, United Nations Summit in September on the Millennium Development Goals. Perfect. 6 months later. How are we doing? Let's have a series on that. So but I said that to the audience. How many of you are actually going to do it tomorrow morning? Report back. Let me know. How did we finish early? That never happens. I never end up finishing anything early.
I'm going to try to get this on one more time.
Gentleman has a question again. She's involved in technology here. It's very tricky.
I believe that the religious leaders, and some of them do speak out, but
Yeah.
so many of the ordinary, like the Muslim leaders, the Catholic leaders, the Protestant leaders, any other parish leader doesn't speak out.
Well, I would encourage all of us to speak out. The momentum could grow and grow and grow and grow.